Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. You know that feeling when you walk away from a conversation just completely confused? Like you're suddenly apologizing for something when, deep down, you didn't even do anything wrong? Well, today we're descending into a pretty fascinating and honestly somewhat mysterious world. We're going to map out the architecture of invisible control. We're going to look at the exact mechanisms and patterns of dark psychology that operate completely below the radar. Let's get into it.
Imagine for a second that someone is slowly changing the way you think, but not by threatening you or forcing you, and definitely not by telling you what to do. Instead, they make you believe that the decision was entirely yours. You start questioning your own memory. You begin explaining yourself to someone who literally never explains themselves to you. And eventually, you don't even realize you're being influenced. You just kind of think you're changing. But here's the truly disturbing part. Some of the absolute most powerful forms of psychological control, they don't feel like control at all. They feel like love. They feel like concern or helpful advice. Sometimes, they even feel like your very own thoughts.
Okay, let's dive into this, because it usually starts with something extremely subtle. Let's say someone says something hurtful to you. Naturally, you react. But instead of discussing what they actually said, you hear things like, "Wow, you're too sensitive," or "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" Or maybe, "I was obviously joking, you're always overthinking." Right there, that is the very first sign of the trap. Notice how your reaction to their hurtful comment has suddenly become the primary problem.
Take a look at how the manipulator pivots the conversation here. The original behavior, the thing they actually did, has completely disappeared from the discussion. Now, you are the problem. And this is incredibly powerful because, well, as humans, we naturally want to be reasonable people, right? When someone tells us we're overreacting, a lot of us immediately look inward. We think, maybe I did misunderstand. Maybe I was being too emotional. And that tiny fleeting moment of self-doubt completely changes the direction of the conversation. The question is no longer what did they do? It becomes what's wrong with me for reacting. You see, manipulation doesn't always require someone to convince you of some massive lie. Sometimes all they have to do is make you just a little bit uncertain about the truth.
Now you might be wondering, why does this work so well? It's not because you're weak. It's just human psychology. We constantly use other people as reference points. We compare our reactions, our opinions, our memories. We're constantly asking ourselves if we understood something correctly, or if someone else would feel the same way in our shoes. When someone repeatedly challenges your perception, your internal reference point actually begins to shift. It's exactly like the classic boiling frog effect. If you jump into freezing water, you're going to notice it instantly. But if the temperature of your reality changes just 1 single degree at a time, those gradual shifts are almost impossible to notice. So let's move into the first part of the anatomy of this trap, the mechanics of doubt. Let's move to and see how this builds, because it rarely begins with a massive, obvious statement like, "Everything you believe is wrong." I mean, that would raise your alarms immediately, right? Instead, it begins with something tiny. Step 1, you remember that differently. Then, a bit later, step 2, no, that's not what happened. Moving to step 3, you're always remembering things incorrectly. Until finally, we reach step 4, you just can't trust your own judgment. Each individual statement by itself might seem totally insignificant, but when they're compounded and repeated over time, these tiny doubts build up to create a completely different psychological environment. You end up experiencing a total loss of self-trust.
So the absolute crucial point here is distinguishing between what's normal and what's actually dangerous. Let's be totally clear. Having a single disagreement is not manipulation. Healthy disagreement happens literally all the time. People genuinely remember things differently, we misunderstand each other, we make honest mistakes. That's life. The dangerous pattern appears when someone repeatedly uses your uncertainty to gain power over your reality. That's the true danger, not the disagreement itself, but the acts of forcing a dependency on their specific version of reality.
All right, moving on to the next section of the trap's anatomy. We're going a bit deeper now into the actual weapons of emotional control.
Most people think manipulation requires talking, but sometimes the exact opposite is way more powerful. Imagine you're in an argument. You ask, "Hey, what's wrong?" They say nothing. You ask if they're sure, and they just say yes. But their behavior? It's distant. It's cold, unresponsive. The silence trap forces your brain to seek closure. When information is missing, you naturally start filling in the blanks yourself. You start thinking, "Oh man, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I need to apologize." Without saying a single word, they've effectively shifted the entire emotional burden and all the blame squarely onto you.
And once someone figures out that uncertainty makes you chase answers, they don't even need to control your actions anymore. They just control your access to information and affection. Suddenly, they show you immense warmth. They're super available. They're complimentary. They make you feel totally understood.
But then, right when you feel secure, it rapidly shifts to distance. They become suddenly cold, unavailable, highly critical. It's like total psychological whiplash.
And then, just as unpredictably, the warmth returns. You never know which version of this person you're going to get, so your brain desperately starts looking for the pattern, thinking, how do I get the good version of them back? This unpredictable reward system acts exactly like a slot machine or a random notification ping on your phone. A predictable reward is nice, sure, but an unpredictable reward? That creates a much stronger, almost obsessive anticipation.
And then, bam, the distance drops again. Concluding this rapid, dizzying loop, you find yourself spending an enormous amount of mental energy just trying to predict this deeply unstable behavior. You're no longer just interacting with a person. You're absolutely exhausting yourself trying to earn back some basic emotional stability.
And this brilliantly illustrates an even deeper level of control. There's a devastating difference between you made a mistake, which is simply correcting a behavior, and you always ruin things, which is a direct attack on your identity. Look, a behavior can easily be corrected, but when your behavior is equated to your identity, you're forced to defend your very sense of self. If you repeatedly hear that you're selfish or difficult or impossible, you might actually start filtering your own behavior through that label. Without even realizing it, you unconsciously start believing and behaving according to a negative identity that someone else assigned to you.
Here's another pattern that is so often missed. Someone does something nice for you, right? But later they use it as ammunition. After everything I've done for you, you won't do this one little thing for me? This highlights the stark contrast between a healthy favor, which is a gift, and a manipulative favor, which is a debt. Healthy reciprocity involves giving and receiving, but here's the key. You are always free to say no. Manipulative reciprocity distorts this entirely. It basically says, I helped you, therefore you owe me obedience. A true favor should create gratitude, never ownership. Okay, let's move to our final section, the escape hatch. Let's talk about the boundary test.
All right, let's take a collective breath here and ground ourselves. The deepest realization we can have is that the strongest influence doesn't attack your freedom directly. It changes how you interpret your freedom. Your lack of freedom has been brilliantly disguised as your own choice. You think you're choosing peace by apologizing when in reality, you've just been conditioned to believe that every conflict is your responsibility. So let's redefine manipulation. Not every person who behaves in these ways is some secret psychological mastermind. Sometimes they're just insecure, or maybe they're just really poor communicators. That's exactly why you shouldn't just go around diagnosing people. Instead, treat manipulation simply as a pattern. And it's a pattern you can instantly expose by seeing how someone reacts when you simply stop cooperating and set a reasonable boundary.
To protect yourself, I want you to walk through this empowerment checklist. Whenever you leave a conversation, ask yourself, was I actually allowed to disagree just now? Can I say no without being emotionally punished for it? Does this person ever take responsibility for their own behavior? And perhaps the most vital question of all, do I feel more confident after interacting with this person or more confused? Remember, your goal here isn't to be paranoid about everyone you meet. Your goal is simply to become practically impossible to psychologically confuse. Which leaves us with one final, absolutely vital question. What happens when you just say no? Listen, don't judge a dynamic by what someone says when you agree with them. Watch what happens when you don't. When you calmly say, actually, I remember it differently, or when you completely refuse to accept blame for something you didn't do. That right there, that is where character becomes truly visible. Someone who respects you doesn't need you to abandon your own perception just to maintain the relationship. Ultimately, the most powerful response to manipulation isn't trying to manipulate them back. The ultimate response is undeniable, unshakable clarity. Think about that for a moment and ask yourself, who in your life truly accepts your no?